Well, it's with both pleasure and pride that I introduce our speaker today. Alex Rossmiller is a National Security Network Fellow and a former intelligence officer for the Defense Intelligence Agency. He is a member of the Truman National Security Project, and his commentary has appeared in a variety of places, including the American Prospect, and he's a regular blogger and has contributed to the Huffington Post, among other places in cyberspace. He's presently, believe it or not, studying law at the University of Michigan. So he's coming from Ann Arbor to speak to us here today. But I think perhaps his most impressive accomplishment is that he is an alum of Middlebury College, class of 2004. And he is also an alum of PS 311, American Foreign Policy. And I know a number of my students are here today, so you too can become like Alex if you work hard and study hard in my class. He's also he's a political science major, so many have contributed to his education here. Most importantly, he's the author, believe it or not, at this young age of a brand new book with Random House that's getting some good reviews and good publicity called Still Broken, A Recruit's Inside Account of Intelligence Failures from Baghdad to the Pentagon. We have copies over here if anybody's interested in picking it up. I've read it, and it's an admirable debut book, and in my humble opinion, personal opinion, I think Alex has found his calling in writing, but I suppose a law degree on top of those skills can't possibly hurt. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Alex Rossmiller back to Middlebury College.
Thank you. Thanks to Professor Stanger, of course, and to Middlebury for having me back. I thought that I would be banned forever, but I've managed to make my way. And it's true, I've managed to make it so far despite having taken 311, and I hope that many of you will as well. So let me get right into it. I wrote this book, and it's about my time working on and in Iraq. And so what I'd like to do is do a quick run through about Iraq stuff, sort of as a basis. And then talk a little bit about the book, and really what I'm most looking forward to is Q&A. I know I sat through a lot of things here in this room, and that was always the part that I was waiting for. So we'll try to get to that quickly. And just really as background, you don't work for the government without feeling like you have to do everything in PowerPoint. So that's what I have here, is a pretty bad PowerPoint presentation, but it'll get us to the content that I want to address. So. The first thing is who am I? And I think Professor Stanger did a pretty good job of explaining that. I'm class of 2004, and to here? Yeah? Sorry. So I'm class of 2004, which means that if I have my math right, that some of you have been here longer than I've been out, which I think is neat. And it wasn't so long ago that I was sitting in those chairs, and not that really, very few of you, I think, should aim to be like me, but maybe to take some of the same career paths if this interests you. So that's who I am. Why am I worth your time? I mean, really, probably the book would be the best answer to that. But also, I remember being here not too long ago and wondering how this stuff works, and I have a little bit of perspective on it now, and I hope that will be of interest to you guys. The disclaimers, which I am still required by contract to say, these are not the views of the United States government. They're not the views of the Defense Intelligence Agency, nor of the Pentagon. I think that'll be pretty clear, but I have to say it nonetheless. And what are we going to be talking about? Just a quick overview of what's going on in Iraq. What is the intelligence community all about, at least from my perspective and experience? And then where do we go from here? So, what is going on in Iraq? One of the reasons why I thought it was important to publish the book is because there is a lot of news coverage that's really about the day-to-day, and it's what happened yesterday or last week, and it's not so much about whether things are getting better or worse overall, and that's true both in terms of Iraq and in terms of how the government is working on it, how the intelligence community is approaching it, how the executive branch is managing it, and the importance of trends, right, as opposed to did we build a school or did a school get blown up? Are there more schools being built? Are there more schools being blown up? And I think that that's an approach that is taken too infrequently. And the media sucks at this because there's no news in trends in general, right? There's no hook a lot of the time to say that, okay, for this sort of random period of time, we're going to look at how things have gone overall as opposed to what happened yesterday. And really, I think in order to find those things, you have to look in the more long form, or you have to look at more analytical pieces. And I was like the really nerdy kid when I was young who was reading the op-ed pages more often than the news, and that was because I liked the analysis. I like knowing the why and the how, at least as much as and maybe more than the what. So, again, I sort of assume that a lot of people 5 years in have this information, but how many people in Iraq? Who are they? We have about 140,000 troops, roughly 30 to 35,000 of whom are combat forces. And I put the scare quotes on combat because there really aren't front lines in Iraq. I mean, I think maybe similar to Vietnam, but even then, you had pictures of people who were relatively secure in cities. And there just is sort of no protection in Iraq from a random rocket or a random mortar being lobbed over a wall. So those are the numbers. Will this increase or decrease? People always people always ask me, and it used to be like my parents, and now it's interviewers, whether that number will go up or down. I think the answer to that is it'll probably be about the same over the next year or so, and then obviously the election will have a lot to do with where those numbers go after that. The surge is starting to, the effects in terms of overall troop numbers of the surge starting to diminish. We're back to, or pretty close to pre-surge numbers, and I think we'll be there completely by this summer. And if people are interested in those specifics, we can talk about it in Q&A as well. So really, really fast, right? Again, we've been at war for like 5 years. I think that probably a lot of you know this stuff, but Iraq was created by the British Empire essentially after the Ottomans fell. The Middle East was sort of divvied up into colonial or semi-colonial areas. Again, this is, if you really want to know this, like, find a book. I'm not that smart about it. But I do know that, in terms of modern times, like, you have your sort of three main groups in Iraq that are struggling for power. You have the Kurds in the north, and they identify more with their ethnicity than their religion. And then you have Arabs in the west and the south, generally speaking. And those are a Shia majority at about 60% of the population and a Sunni minority at about 20%. Of course, the vast majority of Muslims worldwide are Sunni, and so you have a Shia majority in Iran and Iraq are sort of the two biggies in the Middle East. And so under Saddam's rule, it was the minority Sunnis that were in charge. They had all the power. Again, it was roughly 20% of the population. There hasn't been a census in, I think, roughly 80 years, so everybody fights about it. But basically, there's a Sunni minority that was in control and pretty much subjugated the Shia in the south and the Kurds in the north to a large degree. Now, the Kurds are mostly independent at this point, having had a lot of support from the U.S. and internationally, and the Shia are now more or less running the government. But those are the three groups that you have fighting for power. Most of Iraq's oil is in the south, which is Shia-controlled, which is why I think for people who follow this stuff closely, the situation in Basra, which is the southernmost province, is the most interesting. And then, of course, Baghdad is sort of everybody. So that is just your 30 seconds on the war. What are we doing right and what are we doing wrong is a perennial question. And every 6 months or a year when there's a new strategy or new commander, we ask again sort of how we're doing things and whether it's good or bad. So there, initially, at the beginning of the war, we didn't think that there was going to be a big insurgency. Or I thought that there would be some problems, but the people who were running things didn't think that there would be a significant insurgency, and so troops were mostly put on large bases to sort of just have control in general of their area of operations. Then we moved to more of a counterinsurgency model in some areas, and sometimes not. It was sort of dependent on the local commanders, dependent on the local situations. We played whack-a-mole for a long time, just chasing insurgents from town to town. I think never really had enough troops to control or even sort of have eyes on most of the country. And now there's been a return, again with the surge and with General Petraeus, to a counterinsurgency strategy. It's not entirely clear to me. I mean, I think what was happening before, a lot of people called counterinsurgency. This is more sort of an academic approach, what's generally considered classic counterinsurgency. And it does seem to be having some effects on violence, though not necessarily on the political process. In terms of Iraq itself, I think that there is really a little bit of a disconnect in terms of how people think of what the average maybe day is like for an Iraqi. And I don't want to get too much into that, but the sort of the measures of civil society are poor at best. Most Iraqis have an average of 2 to 3 hours of electricity a day. I think something like 35 to 40% of the country has potable water, drinkable water on a consistent basis. And oil production continues to be still below pre-war levels, which hurts the economy, obviously. And a lot of that money that does come from oil, it just came out, I think, a week or two ago, is being sort of shuttled off into banks in, the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. So a lot of that doesn't end up getting back into the economy, and certainly not into infrastructure building. And, we sort of think of electricity as like your fridge doesn't work for a little while. But when it's only 2 to 3 hours a day, you can't run businesses. I mean, you don't have a functioning economy. There's nothing for people to do other than like sleep on their roofs and hope that they don't get bombed because it's too hot to be in their apartments. I mean, I was there from March to September of 2005, and it's hot. It's hot in the summers. Electricity is helpful for keeping things cold. So the infrastructure is really a difficult thing right now, and it's partially because the resources haven't been put to it, and it's partially because when resources are put to it, this stuff gets blown up. And again, this last, and again, maybe I'm being a little bit harsh. I think the counterinsurgency model now is a little bit better than it was, but before we'd take a town and sort of level it and have the insurgents leave and then try to build it back up, and then we would leave. Somebody else would come back in. So that was, certainly a problem in terms of strategy, which I think continues to some extent today, although maybe less so. I should say this is the only picture that I didn't take in Iraq. So this is not, fortunately. So what happens next in Iraq? I think, when I was at the Pentagon and when I was doing this stuff for the government, it was a really, maybe exciting time is the wrong word. It was a turbulent time in terms of the politics of Iraq. There were elections, there was a constitutional referendum, and there was all this hope that they could set up this sort of functioning government, and it really has stagnated in the last year or so. Just not a lot has happened. I'm not a very good pundit because a lot of people ask me to do interviews or to comment on situations, and they say, what's Iraq going to look like in 6 months? And for the last maybe 3 years, I've been saying it's going to look just like it looks today, which doesn't get me on the news very often because it's not that interesting. But I think that that's true, and it's true today, with maybe the exception of a couple significant elections that may be coming up. But there's not a real lot of impetus to change for Iraqis right now. The people who are in leadership positions know that because U.S. forces are there in significant numbers, they can continue to sort of position for power. And there is just so much money to be had from the oil that it really is worth it for a lot of people, especially the leaders who are relatively safe, to just stick it out and keep fighting over that potential bonanza at the end of the road. The Constitution has been okay. There's a little bit of a section in my book where I talk about explaining in a paper that I wrote for my boss that the Constitution was causing problems because it's really not particularly well put together in terms of the facts in Iraq. And my boss told me that I couldn't criticize it because the State Department had written it. So I wasn't allowed to put that in my paper because it would make the State Department mad. But the Constitution is doing okay, not great. And there are supposedly scheduled provincial elections for this coming fall. So just sort of state-based elections, which I think would be really helpful in many ways, and in some other ways would cause just more strife. Again, as power transitions, you have a lot of people with militias, a lot of people with guns who aren't happy about losing power. It's, can be a problem for obvious reasons. A lot of concerns about Iraq being a client state of Iran, which I think is a little bit misdirected. I think that there are a lot of ties between the Shia government in Iraq now, many of whom were exiles in Iran, many of whom have close ties to Iran. But there is also a lot of, there really is, despite the plans to split up Iraq into 3 parts, I think there is a lot of nationalism there. And I think that there will be, certainly a close relationship between Iraq and Iran, but not necessarily a client state that people worry about. And Civil War, I did this presentation a while ago and had some of these same slides, and Civil War was in quote marks at that time because it was back when everyone in the government was disputing that it was a civil war. No, it's not really a civil war. Maybe it would get to that point, but it's not really. And at some point, I don't know exactly when this was, it transitioned to everyone sort of saying, well, of course it's a civil war. I mean, yeah, obviously. But it went from like absolutely not to, yeah, that's old news. I don't know what day that happened. But I had to take the quote marks off because now, sort of everyone recognizes. In terms of our strategy overall, and I went into DIA hoping to do counterterrorism work. And I should say, actually, it is relevant, I guess. I grew up in New York. I lived about 20 minutes north of the city. And, I worked in New York over the summers, like really felt connected. My father worked across the street from Trade Center 2. 9/11, he left when shrapnel started hitting his window. And, that had a great effect on me. I think, and that, I have a lot of company in that, right? I think for millions and millions of people that was true. But for me, I had studied the region a little bit. I had planned to study abroad. So this was my sophomore year when that happened. Actually, the first class, I think that morning, was with Professor Carmola. She's here somewhere. Professor Carmola's Power and Powerlessness class. 30 minutes after we had all read that planes hit the towers. And so I, went that day of 7 hours trying to figure out, whether my dad was alive and what was going on. So I was interested in the Middle East. I had studied this stuff. I was planning on going to Beirut to study the next year, which ended up not happening. I told my parents I was going to go to Beirut, and they said that was like the greatest idea they had ever heard, as long as I wanted to continue to pay for college. So that was their deal. You can go to Beirut, we just won't pay for college anymore. So I ended up in Turkey, which was as close as I could get, and studied Middle East politics in Turkey. And the other thing was, like, I was the only person I knew who could pass a background check to get a security clearance to work in Intel. So I had this opportunity, right? I was interested in the Middle East. I had studied it a little bit, and I hadn't done a lot of drugs. So I hadn't done any drugs, I should say, for the camera. I hadn't done any drugs. I could pass the security clearance. And so I did. I applied to CIA and DIA and a bunch of these other places. And I wanted to do counterterrorism. So anybody with any kind of interest in or knowledge about the Middle East, of course, was put on a rock, basically. So I went in and I hoped to do that sort of stuff. And really, a short amount of time in, ended up volunteering to go to Iraq just because I felt like there were people who were being sent there involuntarily. It was something I wanted to help out with. But really, my interest initially was terrorism. And obviously, the problems in terms of Iraq for terrorism are significant. They're significant, and I think that they're growing. When you give fighters an opportunity to sort of hone their trade and figure things out, that's bad long term. And that's not to say that we shouldn't take military action because it might help other people train. But I think Iraq continues to be a really significant training ground, much like Afghanistan was. You may recall some terrorists coming from Afghanistan. So they're learning, they're exporting, right? These people are spending some time in, just like, our rotations. People rotate in and out of Iraq. They go to Iraq for a little while, 6 months, a year, and then they go somewhere else. And it's, maybe they go back to Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, or maybe they go to London. And it's just hard to know how this information is going. There's a certain type of bomb called an EFP, which is sort of migrated from Iraq to Afghanistan. So these things are not localized. And of course, Iraq is the greatest boon to terrorists, I think, in terms of recruiting, maybe that's ever happened. So the stuff that we don't see on the news or we don't hear about, civilians dying, sort of the more grisly and gory aspects, are everywhere in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, in the Middle East, and really in a lot of other countries, that have media that's willing to show it, maybe. And, just it makes us look terrible, and sometimes unfairly and sometimes for good reason. But it is a continuing problem. Okay. I was in Iraq for about 6 months, which I should say really is not that long. Most of our most of our uniformed service members are there from between 12 and 15-month rotations. I had like a pretty easy job. I was a computer jockey. I was in a relatively safe location. So I don't want to in any way misrepresent the idea that I was like, on the ground in the middle of this stuff on a daily basis. But I spent 6 months there and traveled in and around Baghdad. I wasn't in the green zone technically, but I was in a relatively safe place, as I said. I occasionally went down to the embassy and did some stuff like that, and worked on tactical intelligence. So I was passing informations to units, really at the very bottom level, which I was really excited about. I mean, I wanted to sort of find bad guys and like send forces after them. And there's sort of a longer explanation of this stuff in the book, but it ends up that maybe we're not as efficient as I had hoped or thought. And then I came back, and that was sort of difficult, but I really felt like I was still doing pretty good work, and it was still important to me to stay and do that stuff. And I got back to the Pentagon, and I was able to be successful relatively early at the Pentagon because, in large part because I went to this like hoity-toity college where they made me write all the time. And there were just a lot of people who didn't necessarily have great writing skills where I worked. And most intelligence offices, the papers are due in 2 or 3 months. So you have time to edit it and fix the mistakes and fix, the grammar or the punctuation. In the Iraq office, things were due in 2 or 3 hours, or maybe 2 or 3 days. And so they needed people who could really write the stuff coherently and have it go out quickly. And I was pretty good at it, and so my boss gave me a couple assignments initially that were maybe more high profile than I otherwise would have gotten. And one of those really early assignments, I got really right. And so they let me do more for high-level people. So in Iraq, I was doing this very sort of base level, working with units, intel. And then back at the Pentagon, I was doing really strategic intelligence for people like the J2, who's the primary intelligence advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and people in the office of the Secretary of Defense. So I was doing this sort of high-level stuff, which allowed me access to people who were at a higher level than I otherwise would have seen at, being like a total baby like I was. What I saw from those people was consistent and highly problematic influencing of the analytical process, I think either for political reasons or sort of for careerist reasons. And this is stuff that I think a lot of people have sort of heard about and read about, but I had never heard anyone say or write, it happened to me, and it happened in my office. And I'm not like some sort of martyr or victim about this, but it was pervasive in the office. I mean, everyone, all the analysts who are really writing the initial products felt like we were being told to change our analysis in ways that didn't reflect any kind of empirical rigor. So we would hear things like, that's too pessimistic, and that's not in line with administration projections, and that's off message. So these were sort of the phrases that we heard all the time. And it's funny because I told people these stories when I got out, and they were horrified, and it was just sort of, it didn't seem that unusual to me, and it was really sort of par for the course. I mean, we had what we called a wall of optimism in the office eventually, where people started putting cartoons and like phrases so that we could all be more optimistic as a joke. But it was all on this huge wall. I mean, our bosses walked by it all the time. It wasn't a big deal. And we sort of talked about it, I wrote this paper, but I'm going to have to make it sound like things are going to be better, otherwise it's going to get canned. And we just talked about it openly. And it wasn't, I think, until I had a larger perspective on how big of a problem that was that I felt like it was worth writing and talking about. So I was at the Pentagon for about 8 months after I returned, and as I said, it was an intense time in terms of the political stuff, which is what I was doing. There was a constitutional referendum in that October of 2005, and national elections in December, and that was the work I was doing, and it was great, and I was pretty good at it, and I liked it a lot. But eventually, it just was. Didn't seem like the stuff that we were doing was worthwhile because it just wouldn't get to the top of the chain of command the way that we had looked at it initially. So we're going through intelligence reports sort of every day, just reams and reams, hundreds and thousands of classified pieces of intelligence. I also was a big fan of unclassified intelligence, right? So that's like the news and blogs. I mean, I read a lot of blogs that were written in Iraq. I read a lot of blogs from professors and academics who look at this stuff and who, make it their career. I mean, not necessarily, a lot of intelligence analysts and collectors don't necessarily have a background in this. So whatever information I could get, especially on the political situation, from just like the news that no one else was reading, this blog that maybe a few hundred people a day read, it was really useful to me. And that's incidentally how I got into the blogging thing, which is like kind of a weird and little niche world, but has opened up a lot of opportunities for me as well. So I left the Defense Intelligence Agency because I just felt like I could do better work outside the government. I went to work for a think tank which really, I mean, it's called the National Security Network. It's run by a guy named Rand Beers, who was the counterterrorism director or coordinator for the National Security Council, who resigned on the eve of the Iraq War. And it's just a great organization that took on a young guy with not a lot of experience. And again, sort of allowed me to work there while I was writing the book. I don't know, I'll just talk about this very briefly. I don't know how interesting this is, but the way that I ended up writing the book was a person had talked to me about being interested in it from a publishing house. So I started writing it a little bit, put together a proposal and some sample chapters, and then they ended up bailing on it. They just couldn't get the funding. And so I found an agent. I should say, it was really important to note that I looked for an agent. I got rejected by a bunch of agents. Then I found one who was willing to take it on. And then he pitched it to publishers, most of whom rejected the book. And then sort of against all odds, it got picked up by Random House. So really the way that I've gotten to this point, which is, no great shakes necessarily, but certainly fun, has been through a bunch of people taking chances, and largely taking chances because I, gave them the opportunity to, and gave a lot of people the opportunity. So I, email 10 agents and one comes through, and it looks really good in the end, even though it's 90% failure rate. That's really the way that it's gone. And for people who want to stick around, I'll certainly talk more about that in the career conversation stuff. But so that's where we got to where I am now. The book came out a month ago. It's okay. It has a really pretty cover. It's a good paperweight, and I think that they're selling it over there if you're interested. And it's been a lot of fun. I mean, I've been able to talk about this stuff, which I think is really important, which I am extremely interested in. And, this is the type of thing that I certainly envisioned for myself maybe 20 years down the road when I was in school. And so I got to accelerate the timetable a little bit, which was nice. And from here, Professor Steiner said, I'm in law school, and I hope to, maybe go back into doing this type of stuff when I leave. In terms of Iraq, there's a lot of upheaval, certainly with the elections coming up. I think that, certainly it's my hope that the next administration will take a more reality-based approach to intelligence. I think a lot of the issues that I talk about in the book can, in fact, be changed for the better. I think it can be changed for the better by people who are good going in, and I think it can be changed for the better, especially from the top, with people who are interested in accurate information as opposed to information that's going to help their press release. And I hope that could be done relatively quickly. And the people that I talked to who were my colleagues said that it really was a pretty recent development, this sort of political influence on intelligence especially, and the military as well. And they really thought that given better leadership, that as quickly as sort of this bad influence trickled down, that a better approach could also be formed. So that is my hope, and I'm certainly following these issues closely, as I hope many of you are. I hope that this has been of interest, and I am more than happy to take a ton of questions. So I'm going to go do a couple of students first in terms of questions. Let me, if you just wouldn't mind just saying your name and maybe what you're studying or something like that. But yes, go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Derek. I'm a political science major. I was wondering, when you were there on the ground, did you see evidence of kind of directly or talk to troops who were experiencing kind of the deteriorating physical condition of the U.S. military? Did you see a lot of that?
That wasn't necessarily something that I literally saw. The sort of think tank community that I worked in and with in D.C. has just produced reams of information on that, and I think the National Guard especially is really hurting along those lines, and the military, specifically the Army and the Marines, are having a lot of difficulty with that. And it's both material in terms of equipment and stuff, and it's also morale in terms of how people feel about that stuff. Enlistment and retention is really suffering, I think, as well because of that. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Alex. I'm a poli-sci major too. You mentioned the plan to split Iraq up into 3 pieces, which I think is like Joe Biden's plan. Do you think that's a necessity, or do you think that Iraq will be able to stay as presently constituted going forward?
I think splitting Iraq into 3 parts is a really, really bad idea. Senator Biden has a long and storied past doing very good things on foreign policy, and I disagree with him and plenty of other commentators. I think that breaking Iraq into 3 parts, first of all, is overwhelmingly not what Iraqis want. I mean, you look at any kind of polls, and it's like 90% opposed to splitting it up. And really the percentages that you get mostly are from Kurds, who are like, we're basically independent already, let's just make it official. The problem is that most of the people who are aggrieved in Iraq are Sunnis, who used to be in power, who were living mostly in the West and in major cities, and they don't have any oil, right? So there's really no oil in the west of Iraq. So if you split Iraq into 3 parts, you get like, maybe Sudan or Afghanistan in the west, not in terms of the political makeup, but in terms of resources. The Sunnis don't want to be split off with no resources. And for the Shia, I think still there's a lot of nationalism. And I think that, look at former Yugoslavia, look at the situation in Kosovo right now. Look at the situation in, the Caucasus, even in Russia, where dividing countries up, which was maybe approached in the 90s as a good type of option in these scenarios, I think would be very problematic here. I think it would lead to more ethnic cleansing. I think it would lead to a much, much higher likelihood of regional war. I think Turkey would flip out if that happened, and rightly so. And I think that in both the short term and the long run, that splitting it up is a more bad option than keeping it together. My last thought on that is just that if it's going to be split up, it should be Iraqis who do it and not Senator Biden. Yes.
I'm Molly, I'm an international studies and Arabic major. I just had a question. I'm sorry?
I said good for you. I mean, everybody should take Arabic. I'm not an Arabic speaker, which is totally embarrassing, and that we need more. So, but go
I
ahead.
was just wondering what your opinion is on sort of continuing military presence, like the U.S. military presence in Iraq. Do you think it's sort of hurting more than it's helping, or how long? And there's a lot of discussion, like with people like John McCain, on having an indefinite military presence there. Like, what is your opinion on that?
Sure. I think people really underestimate the harmful effects of having an indefinite presence in Iraq. I mean, in the Middle East in general, but especially in Iraq. I think, again, for sort of the reasons I talked about in terms of terrorism, I think are really problematic, and it just looks terrible. And I don't think it advances our strategic interests particularly. I mean, if it like made some people mad, but was really good for our strategic interests, like I think I could be persuaded about that. But it's my view that the continuing presence, first of all, enables continuing bickering among Iraqi politicians and parties. It allows militias to sort of like keep fighting and avoid compromises, because if they can win while we're still there, when we leave, they'll have the power and they'll have the oil money. I think Senator McCain really profoundly underestimates the damage that our presence does. I think he sort of imagines a Korea model or a Germany model, which I think demonstrates maybe a lack of sophistication in terms of his views of the Middle East, which are disappointing. I mean, this is a guy who obviously has plenty of military expertise, both personally and professionally, and I think that he, I disagree with him in terms of his views on the political situation. Yes.
I'm Sarah, I'm a political science major. I'm wondering what you saw when you were in Iraq in terms of the presence of private companies. And there are professors here who are very interested in private military contracting, sure, that sort of thing. And it's a subject that really interests me a lot. So I'm just curious as to what your experience was.
My experience with private contractors was, I didn't sort of see anything really egregious. But they're generally widely disliked, I think, by the military, certainly by civilians who are over there, State Department officials. There's a real, as you know, I'm sure, there's a real problem with the sort of like the legal structure. There's a problem with priorities. These are groups that I think could do a lot of good in certain scenarios, without oversight and structure, have the opportunity to do a lot of damage. And I think, a lot of the really major problems in Iraq have been real closely connected to contractors. And that's not to say that contracting in and of itself is bad, but there's like a high correlative level, right? So the two contractors who were kidnapped and burned and dragged through the streets, which created just a blow up of Fallujah, and essentially, after a time, the leveling of the entire town. Some of the Abu Ghraib stuff, which was allegedly contractor related, and certainly all the story, a lot of the stories in Iraq of like my cousin's nephew's sister, got shot on the street by like this guy wearing all black hanging off a helicopter. Those certainly there have been problems related to U.S. troops, but like those problems, generally speaking, are not from U.S. forces. So I think right now in Iraq is largely a pernicious force, but it's also one that is necessary in many ways. I mean, it's a very small percentage that is that are the guys with big guns and a lot of people who are serving food. But certainly, I mean, it's a significant problem, and it's not like the military really loves them, but like there are concerns. Like I think there's a real rift there. Yes.
Daphne, political science major. I was just wondering if you could share some of your review of the Iraqi constitution.
Sure. I think the way, it's a little bit in the weeds, but like the protections that it set up for minority groups and the way it allocated votes, I think, led to the political structure as it is now, right? Like, I'm not a huge critic necessarily of how the elections ended up because they're pretty representative in terms of percentages. You basically have a 60-20-20 population breakdown and basically a 60-20, sorry, that's Shia, Sunnis, and Kurds, 60-20-20 breakdown in the government. But what happened was the way that the votes were allocated made it really, really difficult for secularists to win, and not that secularists are, like the greatest thing ever in terms of Iraq. And I have a lot of criticism in the book about our promotion of people like, Chalabi and Alawi. But I think there were people who maybe would have ended up with less sectarian parties and less sectarian goals if we had structured things a little bit differently. The way that we set up the parliamentary elections were really problematic, partially because of our setup, partially because Sunnis didn't participate. But you have like some major regions right now, some major provinces that are, high-level Sunni majorities with Shia rulers, like Shia governing councils, and that's really problematic. I don't even remember specifically what it was in the book at that time that I was criticizing, but like the timelines were also problematic, and the ability for so many people to stop legislation, which was what like a lot of the people in our government were really upset that, even just a few weeks ago, this big sort of three-part legislation was passed where the Sunnis the Sunnis got the thing the Sunnis got was a lot of prisoners were going to be released. Things that the Kurds got were a larger percentage from the budget going to Kurdistan. Things that the Shia got were provincial elections in the fall. And they all like held their noses about the other two things so that each group could get the one thing that they really wanted. And then it went through the parliament, and then one of those things was vetoed with the Presidency Council, which is a three-person group that can veto any law that goes through the Iraqi parliament. And so just one got wiped out. So now everybody's real pissed because, sort of for obvious reasons. So you have a structure where there's parliament, there's the Presidency Council, there's the Prime Minister, and then there's like a National Security Council that's sort of extra legal. There's just we set up a system wherein it's really difficult for anything to happen. A lot of supermajorities are needed, and even like within the parliament itself, nobody shows up. They get a quorum like very infrequently. So it's really a lot of structural problems that are set in place by the Constitution that I think should have been foreseeable in large part. Yes. I'm going to try to go just like around the curve here if I can.
My name's Avery. I'm a political science major, and I'm just wondering sort of your thoughts on the state of the Iraqi army and the Iraqi police, because it seems like, from what I hear a lot in news, that there's still kind of, a broken branch of the government, that they can't do their job without U.S. support and like direct U.S. leaders on the ground, and it seems like that's something that's really precluding us pulling out our military forces from the country so that they can't police themselves or defend their borders yet. So I was just wondering, is that true, and how do we improve it?
Yeah, I do. I sort of wonder about that. The general idea is that Iraqi security forces are not very well trained and not very effective. And I think sort of, compared to our military, that's absolutely true. It's hard for me to imagine that it's necessary that Iraq's security forces be able to like really defend their border. Turkey was in there a couple of weeks ago. Like, we were there and just sort of let them in. So like some countries are going to do that, and it's not going to be a big deal. And like Iran has no interest in invading, right? Neither does Saudi Arabia, certainly. So it's not clear to me that some of the things that we talk about being necessary for the Iraq security forces really are, in terms of us pulling out. And in terms of the other stuff, like Iraq security forces probably couldn't put down the insurgency, either have we. So it's not clear to me what exactly we're looking for from them. I don't think that the Sunni insurgency is going to topple the government. Like, I think that really the only armed forces you have in Iraq, well, there are three besides us. There's the Kurdish Peshmerga in the north, which mostly don't go outside of Kurdistan. And let me tell you, Arab troops definitely don't go into Kurdistan. So the Kurds take care of their own territory for the most part. And then you have two Shia militias. There's Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi militia, which is sort of like a lower level, mostly, or a lot of poor supporters, sort of a populist group. But they're an armed force. And then there's the Badr brigades, which are another Shia militia, which is supported in large part historically by Iran. And so there's no like big Sunni army that's going to topple this Shia majority. I don't know, what capability the army needs for us to sort of turn things over. Certainly they would be hugely or much less capable than they are with us. I think that the effects of that would not necessarily outweigh the benefits of our starting to pull out. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Just ask you two separate questions. One is kind of the tactical level, the other is the kind of strategic bureaucratic level.
Sure.
On the first, how have you seen these operations against high-value targets and so on unfold? You said that you thought there were still some problems with the way those kinds of operations were carried out. The other thing is, we're not necessarily high-value targets, but just bad guys. On the sort of bureaucratic end, there's been kind of a perception that since the Cold War, the Joint Chiefs has been broken, and I'm wondering what you saw on the inside, from the J2 or just generally, what were the issues that came up in your time?
Okay, so the first on the tactical stuff, and this is one of the chapters in my book is about being there for an operation when we passed a bunch of information along to units, and essentially, without getting too specific, my very small group of a few people would try to find information about people who were doing bad things and deserve to be, put in jail and put on trial, or maybe deserve to be. And we passed this information along, and I remember, the first time that I really saw the results. So we found, a small number of people who were going to be in a certain location, and we had, and of course, all these final decisions are made by units. So we pass the information as sort of like a suggested here. If you think that this is useful, go ahead and use it. And there's one operation I was in, they just came back with dozens of people. I mean, they came back with tons of people who were also there and couldn't really decide whether the guys that we had thought were bad were there, couldn't necessarily tell people apart. Didn't speak Arabic, even if they did. It's not like people are going to raise their hand and say, yeah, we're the two people you're looking for. So you just brought back a ton of people, and there's these field interrogations where they try to talk to people literally, it was a field. It's like everybody, handcuffed and lying face down in one dirt area, and then we had a couple tables set up for, quick questioning in the other area. And what happened was the units and the initial interviewers, say debriefers, figured these guys were all in a bad location. They all had guns in their basement. So let's let the intel and the prison folks figure out who's bad and who can be released. So they basically say, unless there's some really, really obvious reason to release them, and sometimes even if not, they just get sent to Abu Ghraib. So all these people just got sent to prison. And the people at the prison, with the units, I think, having the perspective of, once they get there, they'll be sorted out, and they'll be taken care of. People at the prison and the intel people say, if we get these guys from units, they're bad guys. So they stay. And in that gap, you have a real problem where, right now there's, I think, the latest numbers that I've read are around 25,000 detainees. I think just tons of whom were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if you don't go in an insurgent, you definitely come out one. And I think that there's another 25 or 30,000 being detained by Iraq's government. So from a tactical level, I think, it's hard because from a tactical level, if you're a unit on the ground, you want as many dudes between the ages of 15 and 35 off the streets, right? You just want those people who are by far that's really age and sex is how you figure out who's doing bad stuff on a sort of very broad level. You want those guys off the streets from a strategic perspective, and I understand that, and I've seen the results of what happens. I've seen the horrors, and I've had friends who. So I'm not sympathetic to these guys who are doing bad things. From a strategic level, it's extremely problematic. Just be rounding people up, throwing them in jail, and hoping for the best. And again, in that gap, there are a lot of people who end up in jail who really shouldn't be there. In terms of the Joint Chief stuff, like I think it's a lot. It's very individual based. In fact, I remember Professor Krauss here. I took a class with Professor Krauss on leadership while I was here, and I remember writing this very, very persuasive paper about how the times make the man. Right, like given a certain set of circumstances, most people will act rationally and reasonably and sort of go in a similar direction as someone else who is in the same position. And it's one of the very few things in life that I've really come 180 on. Like, I really should have gotten an F on that paper because it really is a lot about the person. I mean, it just is so much about the individual leader, and how much that affects things really was astonishing to me. And so I think, you know, some of the people that I dealt with were ineffective, and I think basing a lot of their stuff on politics, I think being replaced by better people would do a lot of good. So I'm going to continue this way, yes.
My name is Bilal, and I'm an independent scholar. I have two questions. First, when you were working and you were gathering your intelligence, who were you dealing with? I mean, were the Iraqis, and how many times? And my second question is, how do you feel about waterboardings and other tactics, you know, that are being applied to
Sure.
extract information?
Sure. Two good questions. On sources, really hard to tell. And there's another disconnect in the intelligence community, I think, is between analysts and collectors. And there's just not enough communication between the people getting the intelligence and the people deciding whether it's accurate and what should happen. And in Iraq, you know, some of the, speaking broadly, some of the people who were giving intelligence were highly motivated for good reasons and wanted to be honest and wanted to be truthful. And some people wanted their neighbor arrested and jailed so they could take over their farmland. Like, it was real hit or miss. It was really hard to decide which was which, especially because it's a lot of people who don't speak the language and don't necessarily know the culture and have a hard time telling these things apart. So the sources were just all over the map. How do I feel about torture? I'm against it. I am opposed to it. And I think, you know, in the age of 24, like, I think it's really important to point out that you get bad information from torture. Like, you get bad information. It's not an effective tool to get good information. It's inefficient because maybe even if you get the right answer that you're looking for, you get tons of wrong information that you now have to go chase down. I mean, the thing is, like, people look at it on a very individual level. If I had this piece of information and someone tortured me to get it, I would give it up, right? That's the way a lot of people look at it. But you'd give up everything else, too. I mean, like, torture is, you know, essentially originally used to get people to admit to things that they hadn't done, or to you know, say that they believed in a religion that they didn't, or whatever. Like, these are highly inefficient ways. So speaking purely from a pragmatic standpoint, I just realized, like, it's also really wrong, right? I should say. I'm like, well, in terms of the information you gather, it's not very effective, which is true. And like Jack Bauer should not convince you otherwise. It is like a bad way to get intelligence. It also, I think, is something that America should not do. I just think, like, Americans don't do this. And, you know, I have a lot of pride in, you know, I'm embarrassingly patriotic, kind of. It's sort of maybe sad that I say that. A friend of mine recently, I got an email from someone who read the book and was like, "Dear AJ," and like said, like, "I liked your book," and then was like, "You know, I got halfway through it and I thought you were Republican." And that's, like, fine. Like, I have Republican friends. You know, that's, like, no problem. But I think in large part the idea of, like, what patriotism is and what America is has been co-opted by a very small percentage of people who are false prophets about that. I think the idea even a few years ago that, like, the president could veto a bill that banned torture would have been just, like, absolutely unimaginable. So it's wrong, and I think that we shouldn't do it. Yes.
My name is David. I'm studying Middle Eastern Studies, and I have two questions for you. The first one may be a little more tangential, but just wondering what your whole kind of take is on when Turkey kind of invaded the Kurdish area of Iraq. That's one. And then two is where Iran fits into the whole picture with Iraq.
Okay, so to work backwards. Iran is, like, a little bit east of Iraq. So that's where it fits in sort of structurally. In terms of the political situation, like, the groups that are running Iraq, such as they are, have close ties with Iran. I mean, these are, you know, Shia who were kicked out of the country, who were in exile, who escaped, and there is a lot of sort of back and forth. Iran funded a lot of these exile groups that are now the ones with political infrastructure. And there is, that bond of religion and I think a lot of shared goals. There also, is a significant difference, obviously, in many ways between sort of Persian pride and Arab pride. I mean, I think that there are fewer reasons to believe that Iran is going to be a huge problem in Iraq than we're led to believe a lot of the time. Iran doesn't want a state that's totally falling apart. The only thing that Iran wants less than an unstable Iraq is an Iraq that's a landing point for U.S. military operations. It's like right now Iran is in a tough place because they want Iraq to succeed, but they don't want Iraq to succeed such that it has 50,000 troops there forever. So it's like Iran, I think, again, broadly speaking, wants just enough instability that we don't stay there forever, but not so much that it has like a totally failed state on its borders, which would be a problem. In terms of Turkey, I'm a huge Turkophile. I mean, I love Turkey. I love the people. I spent a semester there in Istanbul. And so I've watched that with great interest. And I think Turkey is just so pissed that Iraq has become this new launching point for terrorist acts against Turkey. I think if there was like a huge terrorist group in Mexico that was launching over-the-border attacks on, the Southwest, we would probably do something about it too. It's hard not to be sympathetic to Turkey, which had the PKK, a Kurdish, separatist group, which was pretty scattered in the Turkish southeast, then essentially just move into northern Iraq, where Turkey can't get to them, and where they're, basically protected by the Kurdish government. So they came in for a little while, and first it was reported that 10,000 troops came in, and then it was 5, supposedly, and then it was 1,000. Then they're there for 2 days, but then it was 2 weeks. Like, it was really unclear what the whole scenario was in that case. But I think that's just going to happen, at certain intervals where Turkey, gets fed up and tries to do something about the PKK until either the Kurds or, the U.S. does something about that in the north. Does that answer your question? Okay, so we're going to keep going left? Yes.
My question, I'm Michael Katz, and I'm still a student of Russian, and I teach it here. My question is to move back to Kurdistan. You said Turkey would be justifiably outraged if something happened. You're against the Biden tripartite division.
Sure.
You say Arabs won't go into Kurdistan. So what's the solution for the Kurds?
I mean, I think just sort of an autonomous section. I think to call it a different country and to make it a different country would be regionally problematic in terms of Turkey. Iran doesn't want it. Turkey doesn't want it. Nobody around the region wants it. The Kurds want it, but I don't think that the Kurds are losing too much in not having. The Iraqi flag does not fly in Kurdistan, right? Like, Arab forces do not go into Kurdistan. So they're making oil deals on their own. They're running like a state. And, again, I said deservedly so that Turkey would be mad, but deservedly so, the Kurds are running their territory like a state. It's relatively functional. It's relatively secure. They have generally a monopoly on violence. And I think sort of that's the solution, is just to keep going in that direction. I think former Yugoslavia, sort of Russian bloc areas show that it's difficult to break countries up, that, unintended consequences, as long as the Kurds are okay, making a bunch of money and not flying the Iraqi flag, that's the best place to keep it for now.
But isn't that going to inspire the Kurds in Turkey to either join the Kurds in Iraq or
with sort of de facto independence?
Continue the actions against the Turkish government?
Oh, sure, but if you made Kurdistan an independent entity, I think that would inflame the Kurds in Turkey more so than it would pacify them. So I think you'd hear the Kurds and again, it's really a tiny percentage of Kurds in Turkey who want to be independent. I think it's a relatively small minority, but I think that they would say we want to break off and join Kurdistan, as opposed to we want to break off and join Iraq because Kurdistan is sort of a semi-autonomous zone. Yes.
My name's Kevin. I'm a geography major, and I'm assuming that if you're blogging and kind of writing for Huffington, that you're pretty dialed into domestic politics. So I'm curious what you think about. You touched on McCain, but what about Obama? Where is a junior senator with no military experience and no kind of foreign service experience getting? Where's his foreign policy coming from, and what do you think of it? And if he is elected, who is going to help direct it? What do you think his take is on Iraq and the Middle East? And
Sure. I think, I think in terms of experience, I think experience is getting talked about a lot now because it's something that both Senators McCain and Clinton can sort of hang their hat on in different ways. But that's become a campaign meme. I don't think it is as important in terms of the foreign policy stuff specifically as maybe it's made out to be. You had a really experienced foreign policy team in the Bush administration. Really experienced, really bad judgment. And, I think judgment is an important thing. You have, Senator Obama who showed really good judgment in 2002. And in terms of who's working for him, until 2 weeks ago, one of my favorite people on the planet, Samantha Power, was working for him. And I just think it's a shame that she is no longer. I mean, she is just revered among foreign policy intellectuals, especially in my generation and maybe the generation above. She blurbed the book, which was like basically the highlight of my life. There's a quote from her on the back of the book. I think there are people like that who are sort of the next, maybe not even the next generation, but people who didn't get a lot of respect in democratic foreign policy circles because they were insufficiently supportive of the war, who are working for Obama and I think doing a good job. His main foreign policy advisor is deployed to Iraq now. He got sent off. He was a reservist and is serving in Iraq. And I think his background, his sort of international background will help a lot too. So I'm not particularly worried that, a lack of like being on the Foreign Relations Committee for long enough is going to, kill our nation's foreign policy. And I do think that he has good advisors who will be helpful in shepherding that. So I'm going to keep going left, yes.
My name's Mike Palmer. I'm a student of ethics, and my question would be, could you give us your thoughts on why we are so incompetent?
That's a legitimate question. I have to say, I tried really hard in the book, and I try still to really limit my overall judgments to stuff that I saw and experienced, or like political commentary in general. But like, it's hard for me to say, having done this, having been in Washington for just a few years, like why that inefficiency happens. I think other people have written longer and better books about how politics played more of a role than experience in terms of managing the situation in Iraq, So I think someone who was more high level could probably better answer that question. Where am I going next on the line? Yes.
My name's Paul. I'm an engineer. I'm a member of the community. I'm just curious if you could give us an example of something you did not get right, and how that's helped you with your work, and perhaps help focus you.
Sure. Sort of a lot of the like analysis in terms of Iraq, I can't really be that specific about the stuff that I got wrong in terms of analysis. There was a time where I thought that political pressures, this is like a little bit of a cop-out, but I'm going to roll with it anyways. There was a time where I thought political pressures would lead to troop withdrawals. I really sort of fell into that trap of like, okay, this 6 months is going to be the 6 months that really matters. And I thought before the 2006 elections that we would start to draw down troops, just because I thought that that the president would think that it would help, the political situation for his party. And so there was a while where I sort of like thought that really we would start to draw down troops because it was hurting our strategic posture and because it wasn't being that effective in the country. That was wrong. I've like since learned my lesson from that, which is to listen to people when they say they're going to do something. When the president says like we're staying, that he probably means it, to never underestimate the power of inertia and the status quo. Now I know Professor Williams was like the first one to raise his hand, and so I finally get to you. I apologize.
Oh, okay. This will be our last question.
Okay. Can I do one more after that? There's one in the back. Is that all right?
Why don't we cluster them because we're almost over, and then you can respond.
Oh, perfect.
I wanted to ask Alex about the consumption patterns of the intelligence that you were generating while you were because you had mentioned that there were some political pressures brought to bear, and information as it was produced at your level wasn't going up the chain of command. So the question that I have is, first, who's the ultimate consumer of the kinds of intelligence you're producing? And going up the chain of command, is that solely within the Department of Defense? Did it blend over into the civilian leadership? And then in terms of the pressure, was that coming down either the DOD ladder, or was it coming down the political ladder, or was this the crossover?
Okay, let me take. You've been waiting for a while too. Go ahead and just ask.
All right. My question was, after this next election, if we do end up with an administration that decides to put sort of reducing troop numbers and withdrawal in Iraq as kind of a high priority, what problems do you see occurring, or what possible problems do you see us having to overcome as we withdraw troops, and how quickly do you think that process could reasonably be completed without causing serious damage or collapsing what we have what small feats we have achieved in building back up.
Sure, sure. Okay, so I'll do those two really quickly, and then I'm more than happy to talk afterwards. But in terms of the consumers, it was so scattershot. We just had no idea who this stuff was going to necessarily. So we'd write this, and it would sort of just go up the chain, and we didn't necessarily know who that would be. Like, we would get specific requests from the Office of the Secretary of Defense or from the J2. So sometimes we'd get specific requests, but a lot of the stuff we just wrote, and in Baghdad especially, I was in the Combined Intelligence Operations Center, the hub of intel, and we wrote papers that we read. So it wasn't politically important enough to go up, and it wasn't tactically important enough to go down. So it's like the expression that everybody used was self-licking ice cream cone. Like, it's just like it existed for itself. And we didn't have a good enough sense of who this stuff was going to. I think in general it did go to some military leaders and some. I mean, I wrote this paper that I know got all around because it was about the elections, and it was good. And so I got sort of emails back from these far-flung people. But there's just not enough communication in terms of who that stuff is going to and how more importantly how it could benefit them. In terms of withdrawal, I think both. Pressure coming down was both sort of military related through the J2, Joint Chiefs, stuff like that, and even just your bosses in the office. Some of whom were civilian and some of whom were military. I think in terms of overall, it was a lot from Secretary Rumsfeld, from Vice President Cheney. These are, again, there have been books written by journalists of 40 years who have talked about this stuff, and I didn't find that to be untrue. I mean, that was sort of my sense as well from being in there. In terms of withdrawal, I think Senator Obama has come out pretty clearly talking about a brigade a month, which would take 15 to 18 months roughly. I think Senator Clinton is somewhere around there. It's not clear to me exactly what her residual force priority would be or preference would be. And I think all the problems you always read about are possible, right? Ethnic strife, more deaths, more separation of communities, regional implications. Those are all possible. I think staying indefinitely doesn't solve them. It sort of puts them off. So it's not clear to me that the better scenario is to try to avoid those by staying, but I think that's roughly the time frame that it could happen. I think the quickest is a year to a year and a half. And I think that would be slowed or accelerated depending on conditions on the ground. So really, thank you guys for coming. I appreciate this is a great crowd. As a member of this full audience, so I appreciate it. Thank you.